Before being tried, before being sentenced, they were an active part of the Dachau system. The female guards assigned to their subcamps meted out punishments, organized forced labor, and escorted evacuation marches. From Agfa Kamerawerk to Landsberg-Kaufering, their presence marked the routine of violence that defined the final stretch of the Third Reich. They were not few nor accessory. They received specific training, applied SS apparatus regulations, and exercised control over thousands of prisoners in industrial and extermination settings. Their role was not symbolic. It was operational, systematic, and documented. Who were these women? What roles did they serve within the Dachau system, and why were only a few brought to trial while most faded into obscurity? The execution of Ruth Elfriede Hildner, chronicle of an exemplary sentence. On the morning of May 2, 1947, the corridors of the Czechoslovakian prison in Písek echoed with measured footsteps. A 27-year-old woman walked, flanked by two guards, toward an inner courtyard where a fate that would mark history awaited her. Ruth Elfriede Hildner, dressed in the grey uniform of a civilian convict, maintained his composure as he walked toward a 3-meter wooden post that stood in the center of the yard as an austere symbol of justice. That day, Hildner would become one of the few German women executed in post-war Europe for war crimes committed within the Third Reich's concentration camp system. Her case represented not only the individual punishment of a criminal, but also the symbolic closing of a chapter where female brutality had operated with impunity within the Nazi extermination apparatus. Ruth Elfriede Hildner was born in Germany in November 1919, at a time when National Socialism was beginning to take root in society. Like many young women of her generation, she grew up under the influence of Nazi ideology, likely participating in youth organizations such as the League of German Girls, where adolescents were indoctrinated in racial principles and submission to the totalitarian state. In July 1944, as the Reich faced the collapse of multiple military fronts, Hildner was assigned as an auxiliary guard to the Agfa Kamerawerk subcamp, an industrial facility dependent on the Dachau concentration camp complex. This factory used female slave labor to produce optical components for German weapons, including devices for V-1 flying bombs and V-2 rockets. The atmosphere at Agfa Kamerawerk was extremely tense. The prisoners, mainly women deported from Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, worked grueling shifts under the supervision of a small group of Aufseherinnen. Hildner quickly became known for her willingness to impose physical punishment at the slightest sign of fatigue or resistance. Documents recovered after the war indicate that she developed a particular reputation for beating workers with tools when she deemed their performance insufficient. In December 1944, the SS authorities transferred Hildner to the Helmbrechts subcamp, dependent on Flossenbürg but operationally linked to the Dachau system. This facility housed approximately 500 women engaged in textile production for military uniforms. There, Hildner assumed external surveillance responsibilities and participated in nightly inspections of the barracks, where prisoners later reported acts of gratuitous violence and constant threats. Hildner's criminal career came in April 1945, when the impending collapse of the Eastern Front forced the SS to precipitously evacuate the subcamps. Between April 13th and 15th, the authorities ordered the forcible transfer of the Helmbrechts prisoners south in what would become known as one of the most documented death marches from the Dachau system. During this evacuation, which lasted more than 10 days through Bavarian and Czechoslovakian territory, Hildner exercised lethal authority over the exhausted prisoners. Testimony gathered at post-war trials points to her as directly responsible for at least 2 summary executions of women who could not keep up. In both cases, she used her service weapon to shoot the victims in the back of the head, abandoning the bodies in rural ditches. The march ended abruptly when Allied troops intercepted the column near Zwodow in Czechoslovakian territory. Knowing that the end of the war was imminent and that the crimes she had committed would be investigated, Hildner abandoned her group and hid under a false identity in a rural area. For nearly 2 years, she managed to evade capture, working as a domestic servant and constantly moving between Czech villages to avoid recognition. Her anonymity ended in March 1947, when a Helmbrechts survivor identified her at a local market. The woman, who had lost her sister during the evacuation march, immediately recognized Hildner's German accent and a distinctive scar on her left cheek. The report reached local authorities, who launched a covert investigation to verify the suspect's identity. Elfrieda's name, Hildner, was on the lists distributed by the International Commission for the Prosecution of Nazi Officials. Once her identity was confirmed through documents seized at Agfa and cross-examination, she was arrested and taken to PSEC for trial. PSEC, Extraordinary People's Tribunal, operated under the exceptional legislation in force in Czechoslovakia, which allowed summary trials against Nazi collaborators and those responsible for crimes committed during the German occupation. Hildner's trial began and concluded in a single day on May 2, 1947, reflecting both the strength of the evidence and the expeditious nature of these tribunals. The prosecution presented documentation seized at the subcamps confirming Hildner's presence at Agfa during September 1944 and at Helmbrechts until April 1945. 3 survivors testified about his violent behavior, including an account from a Polish woman who witnessed Hildner shooting a young woman during the evacuation march. The testimonies concurred in describing an arbitrarily cruel guard who applied disproportionate punishments and actively participated in the repression of the prisoners. Faced with these accusations, Hildner denied direct murder, but admitted her participation as an armed escort in the forced evacuations. Her defense relied solely on the argument of due obedience, claiming that she had acted under superior orders and had no possibility of disobedience. The court rejected this argument as a defense against liability, finding that the specific acts documented exceeded any legitimate military order. Based on the evidence presented and the Czechoslovak legal framework, the court found Hildner guilty of war crimes, murder, and complicity in acts of extermination under Nazi occupation. The sentence was death, to be carried out immediately under the current emergency laws. The execution did not follow the traditional method of hanging from the gallows used at the Nuremberg trials. In Czechoslovakia, some people's courts employed a technique known as hanging from a pole, considered more expeditious and symbolically severe. This method, although less common in Western justice, had been adopted as an exemplary form of punishment for the most serious crimes. The procedure was carried out in the inner courtyard of PSEC prison under the supervision of the prison director and officials from the Ministry of Justice. The technique involved securing the condemned prisoner with a harness to his torso, lifting him to the top of the post using a pulley system, and then placing a loop around his neck, which hung from a hook attached to the top. Once the device was adjusted, the harness was released, allowing the body's weight to cause strangulation or, in cases of a violent fall, fracture of the cervical vertebrae. The officials present reported that Hildner remained silent throughout the proceedings. He did not utter any last words or express remorse for his actions. The execution lasted only a few minutes and was officially recorded by the prison warden, who then communicated the completion of the sentence to higher authorities at the Ministry of the Interior. With the death of Ruth, Elfriede Hildner's case was closed as one of the few female Nazi guards identified, prosecuted, and executed in Eastern Europe for specific crimes committed at the Dachau system. Her case did not receive the international media attention of the massive Nuremberg trials, but it was meticulously documented in the Czechoslovak National Archives as an example of direct justice against the perpetrators of Hitler's barbarity. In 1948, Hildner's name appeared on an official list of executioners executed in execution of civil sentences, sent by Prague to the International Committee of the Red Cross. As far as available records indicate, it represents the only confirmed case of execution by hanging of a guard at the Dachau concentration camp, making her punishment a unique symbol of post-war justice in Eastern Europe. Dachau system, architecture of female terror. Dachau concentration camp held a foundational position in the history of the Third Reich as the first systematic extermination laboratory established by the National Socialist regime. Founded on March 22, 1933, in a former gunpowder factory located 16 kilometers from Munich, Dachau served as an experimental prototype where the SS developed the organizational and repressive methods that would later be replicated throughout the occupied continent. During its early years, Dachau primarily housed German political opponents, communists, social democrats, and trade unionists. Initial administration fell to the political police, but in 1936 control finally passed to the Schutzstaffel under the direction of the SS Main Office of Economics and Administration. This transition marked the transformation into a self-sufficient, economically profitable and operationally lethal institution. The experience accumulated at Dachau became the exportable model for later camps such as Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Mauthausen and Auschwitz. The registration procedures, prisoner classification, industrial work organization, punishment systems and disposal methods developed there were systematized and applied on a continental scale. The real structural change came between 1943 and 1945, when the desperate need for industrial labor led the regime to massively decentralize the system through the creation of specialized subcamps. Dachau became the central node of a network of more than 140 satellite facilities distributed throughout southern Germany. This expansion responded to the urgent demand for workers for the war industry, especially after Allied bombing began to destroy the main factories. The massive recruitment of women into the Dachau system was driven by pragmatic human resource needs rather than ideological considerations. National Socialist doctrine traditionally restricted women's roles to the home and motherhood, but the collapse of the military forced the acceptance of female surveillance of prisoners in industrial settings considered strategically vital. Beginning in 1944, significant contingents of women arrived from Ravensbrück, the Reich's main women's camp. These prisoners were strategically distributed in subcamps established adjacent to facilities of BMW, Agfa, Messerschmitt and other corporations producing essential components for the German war effort. The SS administration identified 4 subcamps as epicenters of women's labor: Agfa Kamerawerk, Allach, Mühldorf and Landsberg-Kaufering. Dachau system functioned as a highly organized hierarchical system, with the main camp serving as the administrative, disciplinary and logistical center. All subcamps reported directly to the Dachau commandant, who in turn reported to the SS Main Office of Economics and Administration, SS Wirtschafts- und Verwaltungshauptamt, WVHA. This headquarters, under the command of Oswald Pohl, oversaw profitability, personnel and production, establishing uniform standards for the use of prisoners as slave labor. Subcamps were run by local SS officers, but their key decisions, such as work assignments, increased penalties, or mass transfers, had to be validated by the main camp's central administration. Regarding production output, documentary estimates exist that allow us to gauge the scale of exploitation. The Allach subcamp, for example, produced aircraft engine parts for BMW in volumes exceeding 1,000 units per week on its main lines, using a combined workforce of over 10,000 prisoners. Agfa Kamerawerk, with between 400 and 500 women, produced thousands of units of precision optical components per month, including electronic fuses and ignition timers for heavy weapons. Output was measured in man-hours per piece, and the Offizierinnen were instructed to maximize efficiency even at the cost of the inmates' health. Maintaining these subcamps required a complex logistical network. Food, uniforms, tools and medicine were not produced on site but were distributed from Dachau via rail caravans or trucks assigned to the SS system. Reich contractors, such as Hermann Göring Werke and various German textile firms, participated in the delivery of basic goods. Daily food was partially financed with funds from agreements with private corporations that rented prisoners for daily rates, while hygiene items, clothing and industrial equipment were supplied by Waffen, SS logistics units with rotating inventories. This model transformed Dachau not only into a center of repression, but into a decentralized factory where each subcamp functioned as an industrial cell subordinate to a central economic planning system. Agfa Kamerawerk was established in September 1944 as an industrial extension of the main camp. The prisoners, predominantly Polish, Hungarian and Czech, were assigned to the Agfa factory, a subsidiary of the chemical conglomerate IG Farben. Its production focused on optical devices and electronic components for advanced weaponry, precision fuses, bomb timers and sensitive elements for the V-1 and V-2 missiles that bombed London. The average workforce ranged from 400 to 500 women subjected to shifts exceeding 12 hours in industrial environments characterized by intense heat, exposure to toxic chemicals, poor nutrition, and relentless discipline. Direct surveillance fell to a small group of Aufseherinnen who applied control using methods ranging from psychological threats to systematic physical assault. The Allach subcamp, opened in February 1943, became the largest in the Dachau complex, holding over 10,000 prisoners by the end of the war. Its primary function was to supply aircraft engines to BMW and provide logistical support to the Reich Air Ministry. Although initially male, the increase in female prisoners in 1944 led to the creation of female sections dedicated to the assembly of small parts, cleaning of mechanical components, and transporting materials. Conditions at Allach were particularly harsh due to the volume of production required and the constant pressure of Allied bombing raids on the BMW facilities. The women worked under strict surveillance, subjected to daily inspections, work in adverse weather conditions, and constant monitoring that combined direct supervision with systems of internal denunciation among prisoners. Mühldorf complex was part of one of the Reich's most ambitious projects, the construction of underground bunkers to protect fighter aircraft production from Allied bombing. This program was specifically linked to the Messerschmitt Me 262 aircraft, whose production was to be moved to underground facilities to ensure production continuity. The prisoners at Mühldorf carried out massive excavations, moving tons of stone material and reinforcing concrete structures without modern machinery. Mortality due to crushing, dehydration, and exhaustion reached extreme levels. Surveillance was staffed by a combination of male and female guards who used coercive methods, including instruments of punishment, attack dogs, and threats of immediate elimination. Landsberg-Kaufering represented the largest and deadliest sub-complex of the entire Dachau system. This network of 11 camps, opened in June 1944, housed more than 30,000 prisoners, including approximately 4,200 women deported mainly from Hungary after the German occupation in March 1944. The population also included hundreds of girls and elderly women in extremely vulnerable conditions. The work was directly related to the construction of underground factories for the production of the Messerschmitt Me 262 and other advanced weapon systems. The women performed tasks that included loading structural beams, pouring cement, transporting rubble, and assembling industrial components. Food consisted exclusively of watery soups and moldy bread, while hygienic conditions were completely non-existent. Documentary estimates indicate that between 40 and 50% of the female prisoners at Landsberg-Kaufering died before the Allied liberation. The predominant causes were starvation, typhus, pneumonia, untreated skin infections, and summary executions for failure to meet work quotas. The total number of women prisoners within the Dachau system between 1944 and 1945 is estimated at a minimum of 15,000, according to documents from the Central Office for Documentation of Nazi Crimes. This population included deported Jews, political prisoners, French resistance fighters, Roma women, and civilians from occupied territories. The number of active female SS guards in these subcamps ranged from 50 to 70 Aufseherinnen. This relatively low proportion was compensated for by the use of collaborating prisoners known as capos, who exercised internal control over their fellow prisoners in exchange for better survival conditions. The female surveillance structure operated under the principles of economic efficiency and social control. The Aufseherinnen received specific training at Ravensbrück before being assigned to the subcamps, where they learned techniques of intimidation, industrial work organization, and the application of graduated punishments. Their authority extended from direct labor supervision to the selection of prisoners for special punishments or punitive transfers. This architecture of female terror at Dachau responded to a strictly military and economic logic in which women were treated as expendable resources within the Nazi war production machinery. Their surveillance was exercised with institutional precision by a small but lethal group of SS women who in most cases never faced judicial consequences for their actions. Executioners with a woman's face, the mistresses of pain. Beyond the paradigmatic case of Ruth Hildner, the Dachau women's subcamp system produced other figures who left indelible scars on the memories of survivors. These women were not individual aberrations, but systematic products of a machinery that transformed ordinary people into instruments of terror. Their stories reveal the diverse faces that institutionalized cruelty took. Anna Schmid operated in the Allach subcamp during the final months of the war, between September 1944 and April 1945. Allach served as the nerve center for aircraft engine production for BMW, requiring absolute technical precision from the prisoners assigned to the assembly lines. In this environment of extreme industrial demand, Schmid developed a methodology of terror that distinguished her among the Aufseherinnen. His approach differed from the typical pattern of explosive violence. Schmid cultivated a constant, intimidating presence, systematically walking through the lines of workers during morning inspections. He carried a short baton attached to his belt, but its effectiveness lay in the implied threat rather than its continuous use. When he intervened, he used industrial tool handles to strike specific areas, faces, hands, ribs, directing the impacts to cause maximum pain with minimum lost production time. The Allied Bureau of Investigation files document a specific pattern. Schmid applied punishment scaled according to his perception of the severity of the infractions. A minor assembly error resulted in a slap. A mishandled tool led to hands being hit with wrenches. Any sign of fatigue or sluggishness triggered beatings that frequently resulted in fainting. A Polish prisoner declared that Schmid didn't need to scream because her cane spoke for her. This economy of violence reflected a cold calculation to maintain terror with minimal disruption to production. Schmid disappeared before liberation and was never captured, suggesting careful planning for her escape. Mühldorf complex, Fanny Bauer assumed supervisory responsibilities that clearly exceeded normal surveillance duties. Assigned as supervisor of railway inspection teams, she oversaw prisoners engaged in logistical tasks for the construction of underground bunkers. Her methodology was based on collective punishment and the psychological manipulation of group fear. Bauer used a braided whip as his primary instrument, but his true weapon was his unpredictability. He would whip an inmate who performed her duties correctly, creating an environment where obedience did not guarantee safety. This calculated arbitrariness destroyed any hope of protection through compliance with the rules. An incident recorded in March 1945 illustrates his methodology. When a prisoner tripped while carrying railway sleepers, Bauer beat her until she lost consciousness. He forced 3 fellow prisoners to drag the unconscious woman to the barracks without allowing medical assistance. 2 days later, the victim died of internal injuries. Bauer ordered the body to remain on display as an educational lesson. Furthermore, he actively participated in selections for lethal jobs. He assigned weak women to transport explosives and operate dangerous machinery, using high-risk work as a method of indirect elimination. ICRC reports documented 7 crushing deaths under his direct supervision, suggesting a deliberate policy of extermination through occupational accidents. Leopoldine Bittermann, developed in the subfields Kaufering 2 and 6, had a distinct specialization: the manipulation of detention facilities as an instrument of torture. In a complex where typhus, malnutrition, and overwork caused mass mortality, Bittermann added an additional dimension of suffering through arbitrary control of living conditions. Their signature method consisted of organizing nightly internal transfers between barracks, ostensibly to decongest areas, but in reality to punish inmates considered problematic. These operations were carried out without prior notice during rest hours, creating extremely overcrowded conditions that frequently resulted in injury or death by suffocation. Bittermann also ordered pretrial detention in punishment cells. At least 12 independent testimonies describe his arbitrary selection of inmates for prolonged confinement without food or water. This practice was not based on specific infractions, but rather on completely arbitrary criteria: hair color, geographical origin, or simply their personal mood. In April 1945, days before the Americans arrived, Bittermann disappeared along with other SS personnel. Subsequent investigations failed to locate her, and her name does not appear in any court proceedings, suggesting a completely successful escape. Ernestine Brenner operated at Agfa Kamerawerk, developing an approach to control that eschewed direct physical violence in favor of psychological terror and the systematic manipulation of basic needs. At a facility where 500 women produced optical components for Nazi weapons, Brenner established a regime based on calculated deprivation and constant threats. Her main tool was absolute control over food distribution. She ordered the suspension of lunch for entire barracks if a single inmate made a mistake during assembly. She also deliberately denied medical treatment to women with fever, infected abscesses, and open wounds, arguing that medical care had to be earned through improved work performance. A French prisoner stated that Brenner didn't need to hit us because he knew how to kill us in other ways, with hunger, with authority, with desperation. This psychological approach was just as lethal as direct violence, but it left less physical evidence and complicated the subsequent documentation of crimes. ICRC records confirm 4 deaths from prolonged starvation in the block where Brenner exercised authority. The victims had been systematically deprived of food for periods of up to 10 days as punishment for minor infractions. Brenner disappeared after liberation and was never located. These 4 cases reveal the diversity of methods developed by the Officerinnen to exert total control over their prisoners. Each adapted their cruelty to the specific environment of their subcamp, but all shared fundamental characteristics: discretionary authority over life and death, the use of disproportionate punishments as management tools, and active participation in the selection of victims for lethal labor. The behavior of the Officerinnen within the concentration camp system was regulated by internal regulations drawn up by the SS Main Office of Economy and Administration. Although in practice many guards acted with discretion, there were official regulations establishing guidelines on discipline, the use of violence, and relations with prisoners. The Officerinnen were to maintain a balance between productive efficiency and the application of functional terror without resorting, in theory, to punishments that would disrupt the work rhythm or render slave labor useless. The sanctions applicable to prisoners were codified in various service manuals. Among the measures considered permissible were temporary food deprivation, maximum 3 days, confinement in dark cells for minor infractions, beatings with authorized batons on soft areas of the body, and reductions in food rations for low productivity. Additional punitive work outside of regular hours was also regulated, typically in the form of cleaning duties in extreme temperatures or moving heavy materials. On the other hand, the Officerinnen themselves were subject to internal control mechanisms. The senior supervisors of each subcamp were required to submit weekly reports to the main camp command, where productivity and the incidence of punishment were evaluated. Guards who engaged in unnecessary violence resulting in death or disability without authorization could receive administrative sanctions, including transfers, demotion, or disciplinary proceedings. However, these punishments were exceptional and rarely involved criminal consequences. Compared to their male counterparts, the Aufseherinnen applied punishments focused more on behavioral control and humiliation than direct physical destruction. While male guards at camps like Buchenwald or Sachsenhausen were trained to use rifles, attack dogs, and violent interrogation techniques, female staff were often limited to the use of batons, systematic insults, and manipulation of basic conditions such as food, rest, and hygiene. This differentiation did not imply lesser severity, but rather a method more focused on prolonged psychological coercion and incremental punishment. The April marches when the Reich was dying. By mid-April 1945, the Third Reich was disintegrating under coordinated military pressure from multiple directions. Soviet troops pressed from the east while Anglo-American forces consolidated positions in the west. At this desperate juncture, the SS High Command faced the inevitable prospect of the concentration camps being liberated and their crimes exposed to international scrutiny. Their response was an order that would become the final, cruelest episode of the concentration camp system, the forced evacuations known as death marches. April 15th and 25th, the SS, Wirtschafts- und the Verwaltungshauptamt issued specific instructions for the evacuation of prisoners from Dachau and its subcamps. These orders constituted more than a tactical retreat. They were a systematic method of extermination disguised as a logistical operation. The seized documents reveal that the fundamental instruction was unequivocal: evacuate all prisoners deemed fit for work while eliminating those deemed unfit. The directives originated at WVHA headquarters and were relayed to subcamp commanders with military precision. Prisoners were to be organized into columns of between 300 and 1,000 people, monitored by armed guards with explicit instructions to shoot at any sign of fatigue, disobedience, or escape attempt. The women of Agfa Kamerawerk, Allach, Mühldorf and Landsberg-Kaufering were incorporated into these marches under the direct custody of male guards and a small number of Aufseherinnen equipped with service weapons. The evacuations lacked basic logistical provisions. No transport vehicles, medical supplies or sufficient food were allocated. The daily ration was limited to a portion of bread and water only when the terrain allowed access to natural sources. No nighttime rest periods were established. Prisoners slept outdoors in forests, fields or ditches in temperatures ranging from 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. The pace imposed challenged human capabilities, between 25 and 40 kilometers per day without real breaks, with intervals of barely 2 minutes per hour for basic physiological needs. The routes led from the outskirts of Munich to the Bavarian Alps, passing through towns such as Wolfratshausen and Bad Tölz, heading towards Austrian territory on muddy rural roads, some sections destroyed by Allied bombing. The prisoners, weakened by months of malnutrition in the subcamps, began to collapse within hours of starting the marches. Any woman who stopped, stumbled, or attempted to communicate was immediately threatened with death. Reports from the US 42nd Infantry Division described the discovery of more than 2,300 bodies along just 3 main evacuation routes. Some marches lasted up to 10 days. A female column evacuated from Helmbrechts to Zvodau in Czechoslovakia traveled more than 220 kilometers on foot. Of the 580 women who began the journey, only 118 reached their final destination alive. Evacuation marches from the Dachau subcamps followed predetermined routes established by SS commanders based on logistical and topographical criteria. One of the longest and best documented routes was the one connecting Helmbrechts with Zvodau, passing through mountainous and forested areas of Bavaria and Bohemia. The average altitude of the journey exceeded 600 meters, with multiple sections of varying gradient dirt roads eroded by spring rains and segments partially destroyed by Allied bombing. The routes avoided urban centers and detoured along secondary rural paths to minimize exposure to outside observers. The physical effort demanded of the prisoners far exceeded any reasonable endurance capacity. According to contemporary physiological studies, a healthy adult woman requires between 2,500 and 3,000 kilocalories per day to walk 25 to 30 kilometers over rugged terrain. In contrast, the deportees on the April marches received an average of 400 to 600 kilocalories per day, consisting of a slice of black bread, 150 kilocalories, and a portion of water obtained irregularly from streams, wells, or accumulated rain. Dehydration, combined with hypoglycemia and exposure to the nighttime cold, led to massive physical collapse from the second or third day. In operational terms, SS commanders established average walking speeds between 3 and 4 kilometers per hour, with breaks of less than 5 minutes for every hour of marching. Applying fatigue models used by the German army in winter campaigns, it is estimated that a group of underfed prisoners experienced a functional decline of 20% every 24 hours. This meant that after 5 consecutive days, less than half of the prisoners retained minimal mobility capabilities. Documentary mortality estimates can also be modeled by section. On routes such as Allach to Bad Tölz, about 60 kilometers, reports from Allied troops indicate between 300 and 500 bodies left behind, suggesting a mortality rate of 20% to 35% per march, depending on the weather, direct supervision, and the pace imposed. These percentages increased dramatically in rainy conditions, low temperatures, or when the Aufseherinnen adopted repressive measures such as immediate execution for those who straggled. During these evacuations, the Aufseherinnen acquired executive authority that exceeded their surveillance duties in the subcamps. Unlike the relatively passive work of internal supervision on the marches, they assumed direct lethal responsibility. Allied archives confirm that several female guards personally executed prisoners for alleged disobedience or for hindering the advance of the columns. Anna Becker shot a prisoner who asked to stop to urinate during the second day of the march. The body was abandoned in a ditch and the column continued without breaking the established pace. Frieda Riedel repeatedly kicked a pregnant woman who collapsed during the march, causing her to die from internal injuries. The body was covered superficially with branches, and the group continued on without providing a burial. The female guards directed the short breaks, arbitrarily decided which prisoners would receive the available bread ration, and selected those to be relieved from the group, a euphemistic term for summary executions of women deemed unfit to continue. Their decisions were equally decisive in the extremely high mortality rate that characterized these evacuations. Most of the prisoners who died during the marches did not receive formal burial. Their bodies were scattered along rural roads, forest trails, or thrown into drainage ditches. The U.S. 1st Infantry Division reported the discovery of more than 400 female corpses in a single journey between Penzberg and Bad Tölz. Many victims had bullet wounds to the back of the head, open fractures, and advanced signs of terminal malnutrition. Captain James J. Keating of the 45th Division meticulously documented an evacuation march route from Allach. In his April 30, 1945 report, he recorded 708 bodies over 18 kilometers. Most were women. Many showed signs of having been executed in their sleep. Photographs taken by his unit were later used as evidence at the Dachau trials, causing a stir among American prosecutors. The reconstruction of these marches relied heavily on survivor testimonies. Wanda S., a Polish prisoner on the march from Kaufering to Füssen, reported that on the third day only 60 of the original 300 women were still alive. The rest had been executed by the guards or died during the night from hypothermia. Lisa Marie D., a French deportee, secretly documented the 10-day march from Agfa to Kokel in a diary that survived the war. The death marches from the Dachau subcamps represented one of the most systematic episodes of the collapse of the Third Reich. Unlike the gas chambers, these evacuations left no permanent physical structures, but rather human traces spread over hundreds of kilometers. The women who managed to survive faced not only the trauma of memory, but also the challenge of bearing witness to experiences that defied human understanding. Dachau collapses the day it all ended. The morning of April 29, 1945, marked the definitive end of the darkest era in modern European history. At 11:30 a.m., troops from the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions of the U.S. 7th Army stormed the Dachau compound after receiving urgent reports of dire conditions at the facility. What the soldiers found exceeded any previous expectations of the human capacity for organized cruelty. Dachau was not just another concentration camp. It was the architectural prototype upon which the entire subsequent network of Nazi extermination camps was based. From its opening in 1933 until this final day, more than 200,000 people had passed through its barracks and at least 41,500 had been murdered by methods that included starvation, executions, lethal labor, and pseudoscientific medical experiments. Early U.S. military reports described apocalyptic scenes, hundreds of corpses piled like cordwood in central courtyards, barracks overcrowded with skeletal prisoners barely able to stand, and railroad cars parked alongside main tracks piled high with bodies in an advanced state of decomposition. These cars were part of an evacuation convoy from Buchenwald that had arrived days earlier and was abandoned when the proximity of Allied troops became apparent. Inside the main camp, soldiers found between 30,000 and 32,000 live prisoners, many in such dire conditions that they could barely speak or move. Military medical reports documented clear signs of typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, untreated infected wounds, and severe malnutrition that had reduced adult prisoners to weights under 40 kilograms. The official commander, Edward Weiter, had fled days earlier. The remaining SS officer, Martin Weiss, was immediately arrested and subsequently executed after his conviction at the Dachau trials. In the days leading up to the US entry, the signs of final collapse were unmistakable. News of Hitler's death, the fall of Berlin, and the unstoppable advance of the Allied armies prompted the hasty departure of numerous SS officers, administrators, and especially the female staff assigned to the subcamps. The Aufseherinnen in Allach, Agfa, Mühldorf, and Landsberg-Kaufering received contradictory orders to participate in evacuation marches, destroy compromising documentation, or hide among the civilian population. The result was a mass exodus, with most managing to escape without leaving any identifiable trace. Many guards exchanged uniforms for prison clothes or peasant attire, tried to integrate among German refugees fleeing south, or took refuge with relatives and regime sympathizers. Several were assisted by clandestine networks to escape to Austria or cross the Alps into Italian territory. The surviving prisoners provided invaluable testimony to Allied military interrogators. Their accounts agree on one key point: the female guards abruptly disappeared between April 25th and 28th, when the sounds of Allied bombing and the rumble of artillery fire were already audible nearby. A Hungarian Jewish prisoner at Kaufering stated that 4 Aufseherinnen left the facility in a Wehrmacht truck on April 27th, taking supplies and personal documents. Another French deportee indicated that guards burned records and prisoner lists during the night of April 25th to 26th, destroying evidence that could have later identified them. At Agfa Kamerawerk, 2 witnesses reported that the SS women completely abandoned their posts on April 26th, leaving the guard in the hands of a collaborating prisoner and 2 German teenagers. For more than 3 days, the prisoners survived without direct supervision until the arrival of Allied patrols. Several survivors reported that the Aufseherinnen attempted to deny their involvement in the system in recent days. Some attempted to pass themselves off as Polish prisoners or forced civilian laborers, while others stripped off their uniforms before fleeing along back roads. In rare cases, the prisoners themselves identified their former tormentors among civilians posing as refugees. Despite the mass escape, there are records of at least 8 women captured at Dachau or its surroundings between April 29th and May 5th. Most of these arrests occurred thanks to the active intervention of released prisoners who recognized the Aufseherinnen by distinctive physical characteristics, scars, tattoos, or regional accents. Anna W. attempted to pass herself off as a civilian cook when confronted by American soldiers. She was identified by 3 survivors who recalled her Bavarian accent and a birthmark on her neck. Although she was arrested, she disappeared during transport before being formally registered, suggesting the existence of relief networks for former Nazi officials. However, the vast majority managed to evade immediate justice altogether. A 1947 report by the War Crimes Office estimated that only 5% of SS women assigned to Dachau subcamps were formally arrested between 1945 and 1949. The liberation of Dachau represented the visible collapse of a structure of oppression that had operated for more than a decade. The escaped Aufseherinnen symbolized the partial failure of the post-war judicial system to capture all those responsible, but they also revealed the level of social complicity that had enabled the Nazi repressive apparatus to operate. Elusive justice, destinies after the collapse. The unconditional surrender of the Third Reich in May 1945 did not mean the end of history for the female guards of the Dachau system. On the contrary, it marked the beginning of a complex phase of evasion, limited persecution, and in most cases, impunity that would extend for decades. The Aufseherinnen knew they were at the center of a criminal structure that the Allies were beginning to dismantle, and the vast majority had managed to flee before the arrival of American troops. Military intelligence records document that many took pre-established routes to Austria and Czechoslovakia, seeking rural areas where they could integrate into the civilian population. Others took refuge in forested areas of Bavaria using false names, civilian clothing, and altered documents provided by clandestine support networks for former Nazi officials. A classified report from the Munich War Crimes Central Office, dated December 1946, estimated that at least 85 women who had served as guards at Dachau subcamps remained unaccounted for. Investigations suggested that some had integrated into remote farming communities, while others had posed as German refugees expelled from eastern territories. To track these women, Allied services established 3 main methods: systematic interrogation of released prisoners, cross-checking of records seized in subcamps, and the creation of blacklists with personal details and physical characteristics. In 1946, the Bavarian War Crimes Investigation Commission launched a public campaign through the press and radio to encourage citizen complaints about the presence of former Nazi officials. Although most cases remain unsolved, there are documented arrests that illustrate both the search methods and the difficulties faced by post-war justice. Anna Schmid was allegedly captured in Garmisch-Partenkirchen in November 1947, identified by a released prisoner who recalled a distinctive birthmark and her Bavarian accent. She was taken to Munich for interrogation, where she denied having served in Allach, but her name appeared on recovered SS lists. Despite the evidence, she was not prosecuted due to insufficient direct evidence of homicide and was released in 1948. Ernestine Brenner was last seen in Munich in June 1945, apparently hiding in a convent under the religious name of Sister Anna. An exhaustive investigation in 1949 failed to locate her. Her trail disappears completely from official records. Fanny Bauer, identified by 2 prisoners as responsible for punishments during the evacuation marches, was included on the ICRC's official list of wanted criminals. However, she was never arrested, and her subsequent whereabouts remain unknown. Between 1946 and 1948, U.S. military tribunals and some people's tribunals in Austria and Czechoslovakia initiated proceedings against concentration camp personnel. The United States v. Martin Gottfried Weiss et al., held at Dachau between November and December 1945, became the most significant. Although SS women were not the primary defendants, numerous female guards were mentioned during testimony, leading to secondary investigations. In Austria, the courts of Graz and Linz held special hearings in 1946 against women suspected of participating in death marches. Evidence was extremely difficult to obtain. Many prisoners could not remember full names, files were incomplete or destroyed, and the accused frequently denied any criminal involvement. In Czechoslovakia, people's courts conducted summary trials against SS women captured on Czechoslovakia. In many cases, the sentences were carried out on the same day. At least 3 women identified as former Dachau subcamp guards were executed by firing squad in 1946 and 1947, in addition to the case of Ruth Hildner. The final fate of the Aufseherinnen varied considerably. Some received prison sentences of between 5 and 15 years for complicity without direct evidence of murder. Others were sentenced to life imprisonment where multiple testimonies documented specific acts of violence. However, a statistically significant number managed to escape any form of punishment. Records from the United Nations Resettlement Office in 1950 included names of former guards who had taken refuge in displaced persons camps in Austria and West Germany, living under false identities without being identified. Ludwigsburg War Crimes Documentation Center, drawn up in 1964, acknowledged that less than 10% of the SS women who served in Dachau subcamps have ever been subjected to formal trials or actual sentences. The vast majority had disappeared into the anonymity of European reconstruction. Various reasons explain this massive impunity. The systematic destruction of files by the SS eliminated crucial evidence. The Allied priority was focused on prosecuting high-ranking officers, relegating junior officers to the background. The resource limitations of military tribunals prevented thorough investigations. The gradual integration of former Nazi officials into West Germany's new state structures created networks of protection and silence. The prosecution of Dachau's female personnel was fragmented, limited, and ineffective in achieving comprehensive justice. Despite Allied efforts, survivors' complaints, and partial documentation of specific crimes, most of the Aufseherinnen escaped legal consequences. Only a few were caught, tried, and punished, almost all in Eastern Europe, where trials were swifter and often fatal. The collapse of the system did not entail a complete purge or effective collective punishment. Escape routes functioned efficiently, archives were systematically destroyed, and the social silence of post-war Germany sealed the fate of many of the culprits. Dachau was liberated on April 29, 1945, marking the end of 12 years of operation as an extermination center. But for many of the women systematically tortured and murdered there, the war had ended without personal consequences. Their impunity became one of the silent tragedies of post-war justice, a historical debt that remains unpaid to this day.